He was the man who once held a nation's soul in his hands. A soldier, a strategist, a savior. In 1916, when France was bleeding at Verdun, when its armies were exhausted, broken, ready to collapse, one general stepped forward. He reorganized the defense. He inspired the troops. He turned despair into defiance. His name was Philippe Pétain, and the people hailed him as a hero, a living legend, the savior of France. But just 2 decades later, that same man would kneel before Germany. He would sign the armistice that split his country in two. He would lead a government that bowed to Nazi occupiers, enforced their laws, and turned against its own people. From savior to traitor. From glory to disgrace. So how does a man go from one of the most honored soldiers in France to standing trial for treason against the very nation he once saved? Was Pétain a patriot who believed he was protecting France from annihilation? Or was he a coward, even a willing collaborator, who betrayed his people for survival? This is the story of Philippe Pétain, the hero who became a traitor. If you're new here, you're right on time. Hit subscribe, and let's uncover what was buried. Because before we can understand the fall, we must witness the rise. And that begins, not in disgrace, but in the mud-soaked fields of France, where a cautious, unlikely general was about to be crowned a hero. The making of a soldier. The story of Philippe Pétain does not begin with grandeur. It begins quietly in a modest farmhouse in northern France. April 24th, 1856. The village of Cochiotr. A boy is born into a farming family, ordinary, unremarkable, destined, it seemed, for a life behind the plow. His parents were devout Catholics, practical people, survivors in a France still recovering from revolution, empire, and defeat. But Philippe was different. From a young age, he was serious, reserved, observant. While other boys played, Pétain listened. He watched. He calculated. His teachers noticed his sharp mind, but also his caution. He was not reckless, not bold. If anything, he seemed hesitant, weighing every decision as though the world might collapse on the wrong choice. And that, ironically, would become both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. A France of fire and ash. The France of Pétain's childhood was fractured. The wounds of the 1870 Franco-Prussian War still bled. Paris had been humiliated. Alsace-Lorraine, torn from French soil. The nation was restless, suspicious of its leaders, desperate for new defenders. Young Philippe looked at this world of uncertainty and felt a calling. The army. In 1876, at age 20, he applied for the prestigious St. Cyr Military Academy. And he failed. Twice. It would have been easy to quit. But Pétain was stubborn, patient. He tried again. And finally, he was admitted. Not as a star cadet, but as a late bloomer. At St. Cyr, he was no duelist, no charismatic commander. In fact, his instructors dismissed him. They described him as too cautious, too theoretical, too slow to act. One even wrote in his report, "Pétain will never command an army." How ironic. The soldier who waited. When he graduated, Pétain became an infantry officer. But unlike the dashing young generals who rose quickly, he lingered. Promotion was slow. For decades, he remained a background figure, dutiful but unremarkable. He studied. He thought. He taught tactics at the École de Guerre, where he drilled into his students one unshakable lesson: firepower over glory. Men don't win battles, he would say, chalk scraping across the blackboard. Artillery does. To the bold, cavalry-charging spirit of France, this sounded almost cowardly. But to Pétain, it was the cold truth of modern war. And it was this philosophy, patience, firepower, defense, that would one day save France itself, foreshadowing the fall. As he moved into middle age, still a colonel while others wore stars, he sometimes confided in fellow officers. "I am too old now for high command. The army has no use for me." He was wrong. History was waiting for him. Because in 1914, the world would explode into the Great War. France would bleed at every border. And in the mud of Verdun, A nation on the brink of collapse would call for a savior. And that savior's name would be Philippe Pétain. But before Verdun would carve his name into legend, Pétain had to survive the opening storms of World War I, where his cautious style would either prove him right or bury him in obscurity forever. Baptism by fire, World War I, and the road to Verdun. August 1914. The bells of Paris rang, the crowds cheered, the streets thundered with cries of "À Berlin." France, humiliated in 1870, was ready for revenge. But the soldiers who marched with flowers in their rifles had no idea of the storm they were walking into. The old colonel in a young man's war. Philippe Pétain was 58 years old when war broke out. A colonel, gray-haired, cautious, almost invisible compared to the flamboyant generals around him. Many expected him to retire quietly, forgotten. Instead, war would resurrect him. In the early battles, French armies charged recklessly at German guns. Waves of soldiers in bright red trousers and blue coats fell in rivers of blood. Machine guns cut them down. Artillery pounded entire regiments into dust. The generals clung to outdated tactics. They called it offensive à outrance, attack to the limit. It was glorious. It was suicidal. But Pétain was different. The calculating mind. Where others ordered charges, Pétain ordered trenches. Where others dreamed of cavalry, he demanded artillery. One of his officers later remembered. He was calm, always calm. While others shouted about honor, Pétain spoke of survival. He wanted men alive to fight another day. Slowly, this quiet, methodical colonel began to attract attention. His units suffered fewer casualties. His men respected him, not for fiery speeches, but for the simple fact that he valued their lives. By 1915, he was promoted to general. The man once dismissed as too cautious was now being recognized as something else entirely. A thinker who understood modern war. The road to Verdun. And then came 1916. The German High Command had a plan: bleed France white. They would strike at Verdun, a fortress city with immense symbolic value. They believed the French would defend it at any cost, and that cost would destroy them. The attack began in February. The earth shook with the thunder of artillery. Shells rained down by the millions. Hills were blasted into moonscapes. Entire forests vanished in fire. The French front collapsed. Panic swept the army. Commanders argued. Paris trembled. Who could hold Verdun? Who could save France? The answer shocked many. General Philippe Pétain, the savior of Verdun. When Pétain arrived, Verdun was a nightmare. Soldiers were exhausted, supplies dwindling, morale shattered. But he brought order.
Calm.
A voice of reason. His first command, rotation. Instead of grinding divisions into dust, he rotated units in and out, spreading the suffering across the whole French army. His second command, artillery dominance. He lined the hills with guns, using the very doctrine he had preached at the War College. And his third command, the sacred road. He kept the supply line, the Voie Sacrée, flowing with endless trucks, food, ammunition, and men. He told his soldiers one sentence that became legend. Courage. We will get them. The French held, month after month, as shells turned the earth into hell, as men drowned in mud. And fire, Pétain's system, kept Verdun alive. By December 1916, the Germans had failed. Verdun stood. France bled but did not break. And the name Philippe Pétain, once mocked, once forgotten, was now spoken with reverence. The savior of Verdun. But while Verdun made him a hero, it also planted the seeds of his downfall. Pétain believed in defense, in survival, in patience. Others craved glory. And soon, this tension between caution and ambition would rip the French army apart and force Pétain to make the most difficult choice of his career. The mutiny and the man of discipline. Spring, 1917. The fields of France were soaked with blood. Verdun had been saved, but at what cost? Hundreds of thousands lay dead. The men who survived were hollow-eyed, their spirits ground into dust. And then came the Nivelle offensive. the promise of glory. General Robert Nivelle, bold, charismatic, had promised the government a breakthrough. He told them, "We can end the war in 48 hours. Victory is certain." His plan? A massive assault on the Chemin de Dames Ridge. He promised lightning. Instead, he delivered slaughter. When the whistles blew and the French surged forward, German machine guns waited. Within days, 187,000 French casualties littered the fields. The miracle breakthrough never came. The soldiers had had enough. The whisper of rebellion. At first, it was just murmurs. A regiment refused to march to the front. Another refused to leave the trains. Then came open defiance, men singing the Internationale instead of marching songs, scrawling graffiti on walls. "We are not sheep to the slaughter. Down with the war." By May 1917, nearly half of the French divisions were touched by mutiny. Soldiers would defend the trenches if attacked, but they would not march forward to die in hopeless offensives. The French Republic trembled. If the army collapsed, Paris would fall. Enter Pétain. And so, the government turned to the man of Verdun, Philippe Pétain. When he arrived as commander-in-chief, he found an army on the brink of revolution. The men respected him, yes, but discipline was hanging by a thread. What would he do? Crush them with terror? Or win them back with mercy? A delicate balance. Pétain chose both. He restored trust by listening. He toured the front, speaking with soldiers face to face. He promised them no more suicidal offensives. He improved food, rest, leave, and mail from home. He gave them hope that their lives mattered. But he also made an example of the ringleaders. Courts-martial sentenced hundreds. Some were shot before their fellow soldiers, rifles cracking in the dawn air as warnings. Mercy and fear. Bread and iron. The mutiny subsided. The French army bent, but did not break. The shadow of discipline. One soldier later said, "We obeyed Pétain not because we loved him, but because we believed he would not waste us." That was his gift and his curse. He had preserved the army, but at the price of becoming a symbol of discipline, of order, of submission to authority above all else. It worked in war, but later, in peace and in occupation, that same instinct would twist into something darker. For now, France stood firm. But across the ocean, America was entering the war. And with fresh allies, the tide was about to turn. The old colonel from Verdun would soon march into glory once again, only to watch it slip through his fingers in the years that followed. The final push, victory, and the general's fame. The year was 1918. France had survived Verdun. It had endured the mutinies. But the war was not yet won. The German High Command, desperate for a final gamble, unleashed the spring offensive. Millions of men, thousands of guns, stormed across the Western Front. Paris itself seemed in reach. For a moment, the shadow of defeat darkened France once again. And at the heart of it all stood Philippe Pétain, the defender of France. Calm, deliberate, cautious. Pétain was no gambler. He was not like Nivelle, promising miracles, nor like Ferdinand Foch, who dreamed of great sweeping attacks. Pétain believed in one thing: defense and the slow grind of attrition. "We will hold," he told his officers, "and they will break themselves upon us." And so they did. The German onslaught crashed against French lines. Pétain shifted reserves with mathematical precision. Where the line buckled, he reinforced. Where it sagged, he counterattacked. Always steady, never reckless. The Germans bled themselves dry. Allies on the horizon. But Pétain was not alone. Across the Atlantic, the United States had entered the war. By summer 1918, hundreds of thousands of fresh American troops were marching into France. And then came the hammer blow. Under General Foch, now Supreme Allied Commander, the Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive. French, British, Americans, Canadians, wave after wave. For the first time, Germany staggered backward. The unthinkable was happening. After 4 years of slaughter, victory was possible. The Armistice. November 11th, 1918. At the 11th hour, on the 11th day, of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. France had endured. Germany had been defeated. And at the moment of triumph, the people remembered Verdun. They remembered the man who had saved them in their darkest hour. Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun, savior of France. From soldier to legend, crowds cheered his name. Streets bore his title. His portrait hung in homes across the country. To veterans, he was a godlike figure, the general who had not squandered their lives, who had defended rather than destroyed. He was made a Marshal of France, the highest military honor. His career had risen from obscurity to immortality. And yet, beneath the glory, something was shifting. While Pétain was cautious, reserved, even modest, another man was rising in the glow of victory. Ferdinand Foch. Unlike Pétain, Foch was celebrated as the architect of victory, the mastermind of the counterattack. Pétain had preserved France, but Foch had delivered triumph. The seeds of rivalry and bitterness were sown. The burden of glory. Pétain had reached the summit. But glory is a dangerous thing. It creates expectations. It builds myths. And when a man cannot live up to those myths, the fall can be catastrophic. For now, though, France celebrated. Marshal Philippe Pétain was the hero of Verdun, the man who embodied France's endurance, patience, and survival. But history is cruel. And the very qualities that had made him a savior in 1916 would one day brand him a traitor in 1940. As the 1920s dawned, Pétain was at the height of his power. But wars end, nations change, and heroes must find their place in peace. The marshal who ruled the trenches would soon struggle to rule politics. And in that struggle, his destiny began to twist. Between two wars, the old marshal in a new world. The war was over, but the shadow of it lingered everywhere. The trenches still scarred the land. The cemetery stretched as far as the eye could see. A generation had been lost, but Philippe Pétain had survived. More than that, he had triumphed. In the 1920s, France was rebuilding. The hero of Verdun, now Marshal Pétain, carried immense prestige. He was invited to ceremonies, to military parades, to the halls of government. Children learned his name in school. His very presence was a reminder of France's endurance. But Pétain was not a young man anymore. By the 1920s, he was in his 60s, white-haired, reserved, carrying himself with the weary dignity of an old soldier. The hero in politics. France begged him to enter politics. Presidents, ministers, even the people on the street pleaded, "Marshal, guide us. Save us again." But Pétain resisted. He was a soldier, not a politician. Or so he told himself. Still, he could not entirely stay away. He took roles in the government, sat on committees, advised ministers. His word carried weight. His silence carried even more. Yet in the corridors of power, something became clear. The very qualities that had made Pétain a brilliant general made him a poor politician. He was cautious, suspicious, unwilling to take risks. And politics, unlike war, demanded boldness. A changing France. Meanwhile, the world itself was shifting. The 1920s roared with jazz, cinema, modern art. Paris was alive with writers and philosophers. The young were forward-looking, restless, eager to forget the blood of Verdun. But Pétain remained rooted in the past. He was revered, yes, but also increasingly irrelevant to a generation that wanted speed, innovation, movement. By the 1930s, as the Great Depression struck and fascism rose in Europe, the old marshal seemed like a relic. France admired him, but it no longer needed him, or so it thought. Shadows of the future. Yet destiny had other plans. The 1930s brought chaos, economic collapse, political violence, strikes, the rise of Hitler in Germany. Suddenly, the memory of Verdun mattered again. France looked back to its hero, and Philippe Pétain, now in his 70s, was once more pulled into the spotlight. He accepted an ambassadorship to Spain in 1939, a quiet, almost ceremonial role. He might have ended his life as a respected, retired war hero. But then, in 1940, disaster struck. The German armies returned. Blitzkrieg swept across France. The Third Republic crumbled. Paris fell. And once more, in France's darkest hour, the people turned to the old Marshal. In 1916, Pétain had been the savior of Verdun. In 1940, the desperate nation would beg him to save France again. But this time, salvation would come at a terrible price: the collapse of France. The year was 1940. France, once triumphant in the Great War, stood proud on paper. Its army was vast, its fortifications formidable, its people defiant. The world still remembered Verdun, still whispered the name of Philippe Pétain, the man who had once saved France from annihilation. But war had changed. Blitzkrieg. On May 10th, 1940, Hitler unleashed Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks cut through Belgium, paratroopers fell from the skies, and the French defenses were bypassed in days. The impregnable Maginot Line? Outflanked. The mighty French army? Scattered. The German advance? Relentless. Paris itself trembled. Refugees flooded the roads, choking the countryside with carts, wagons, and abandoned possessions. The sound of Luftwaffe bombers became the soundtrack of despair. The return of the Marshal. As the Third Republic collapsed, panic set in. Who could save France? Who could command authority in this moment of doom? All eyes turned back to an old man in his 80s, Marshal Philippe Pétain. He was brought from his diplomatic post in Spain and placed in the government. The people hoped, the hero of Verdun will save us again. And Pétain accepted. But this time, he was not the general of 1916. He was aged, weary, convinced that France could not survive another bloodbath. The fatal decision. June 1940. The German army marched ever closer to Paris. The French government fled to Bordeaux. Ministers argued, should France fight on from North Africa, or should it surrender? It was Pétain who spoke with finality. The fighting must stop. On June 17, 1940, Pétain went on the radio and told the French people, "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today, we must cease hostilities." The hero of Verdun had called for surrender. The armistice. Days later, in a railway carriage at Compiègne, the same site where Germany had signed its humiliation in 1918, Hitler took his revenge. France signed the armistice. The northern half of the country, including Paris, fell under direct German occupation. The south was left to a so-called independent government with its capital in Vichy. And at the head of this government was Marshal Philippe Pétain. From hero to ruler, he justified it to the French people. "I have given myself to France to lessen her misfortune," he declared. To Pétain, surrender was salvation. He believed collaboration with Germany would protect France, preserve its sovereignty, and shield its people from worse horrors. But to others, it was betrayal. The Marshal who had once stood unyielding at Verdun now bowed before Hitler. France had fallen. But the story of Philippe Pétain was only beginning. From the hero of 1916, he was now the leader of a broken, humiliated nation. And the choices he would make in the years to come would seal his legacy forever. Vichy France, collaboration and controversy. The armistice of 1940 left France divided in two. In the north, German boots marched through Paris, raising swastikas over the Eiffel Tower. In the south, a new government emerged, headquartered in a quiet spa town called Vichy. And at the head of it all was Marshal Philippe Pétain, the father of the nation. To many Frenchmen, Pétain remained the fatherly figure of Verdun. White-haired, solemn, his face lined with age, he spoke to the people like a grandfather. Calm, reassuring, steady. He promised stability in a world of chaos. He promised order where there was fear. He promised protection by working with Germany rather than resisting it. "I accept the burden of France," he told them. "Trust me, and I will shield you." But behind those words was a grim reality. Collaboration. The Germans demanded obedience, and Pétain gave it. He dissolved the Republic and replaced it with a regime built on authoritarian values: work, family, fatherland. He cooperated with Nazi policies. He handed over Jewish refugees. He repressed dissent, imprisoning or silencing those who resisted, all in the name of survival, all under the belief that yielding would spare France from destruction. But the cost was immeasurable, the shadow of resistance. Not everyone obeyed. From London, Charles de Gaulle broadcast defiance. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. His voice called for resistance, for honor, for the spirit of 1914 to rise again. And within France itself, small groups of resistance began to form. To them, Pétain was no longer the savior of Verdun. He was a collaborator, a traitor, the man who handed France to Hitler. The nation was split. Pétain, the paternal protector. De Gaulle, the rebellious exile. The burden of old age. By now, Pétain was in his mid-80s. Age weighed heavily on him. Some say he was manipulated by younger men, particularly Pierre Laval, who pushed for closer ties with Germany. But ultimately, the decisions bore his signature. He was still the marshal. He was still the head of state. And history would hold him accountable. The man who once commanded the defense of Verdun was now accused of betraying the very nation he had saved. But what would happen when the tide of war turned? When France was finally freed, what fate awaited Philippe Pétain, the old Marshal of Vichy? Liberation, judgment, and infamy. By 1944, the war had turned. The Allies landed in Normandy. The resistance rose in the streets. One by one, German forces were pushed back. And as the swastikas fell, the tricolor rose again. Paris was liberated. Crowds cheered. France was free. But for Philippe Pétain, liberation was not salvation. It was judgment. The collapse of Vichy. As German power crumbled, so, too did Pétain's regime. He was taken by the Nazis to Germany, then to Sigmaringen, a shadowy government in exile. The man once hailed as the savior of France was now a puppet without strings, stranded in a collapsing Reich. When the war ended in 1945, Pétain returned to France. But he did not return as a hero. He returned in chains. The trial of the century. That summer in Paris, Pétain faced trial. The charges were grave: treason, collaboration, betrayal of the French Republic. The courtroom was packed. The world watched. This was the man who had stood unshakable at Verdun, who had promised protection, who had bent to Hitler. The prosecution called him a traitor. The defense called him a shield, a man who had sacrificed his honor to protect his people from worse horrors. And Pétain himself? He sat silent, proud, unrepentant. When asked to speak, he declared simply, "I gave my whole life to France." Verdict: the jury did not agree. Philippe Pétain was found guilty of treason. He was sentenced to death. But there was hesitation. This was the hero of Verdun, after all. Could France truly execute its former savior? At the last moment, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. The island prison. The Marshal of France, once cheered by millions, now lived out his days in isolation on the Isle d'Eu, a windswept island off the French coast. He was nearly 90, frail, his memory fading. He wandered the prison grounds, muttering of Verdun, of soldiers long dead, of decisions that had reshaped history. On July 23, 1951, Philippe Pétain died in captivity. Legacy of a divided man. Even in death, his memory split France in two. To some, he remained the savior of Verdun. To others, the traitor of Vichy. Hero and villain. Savior and betrayer. A man who carried France through one war and condemned it in another. Philippe Pétain's story is the story of France itself, resilience and glory, fear and compromise, triumph and tragedy. He rose as the defender of his people, and he fell as the man who handed them over. A hero who became a traitor, a savior who became a warning. And his name, forever, will echo as a reminder that history can crown a man and then strip him bare. History is full of men who walked a razor's edge between greatness and ruin. Philippe Pétain was one of them. A soldier who once saved France from destruction. A marshal who once commanded the respect of millions. And yet, in the end, a man remembered not for victory, but for betrayal. His story forces us to ask, can a single choice erase a lifetime of honor? Or is a man always both, the hero and the traitor, locked in one fragile legacy? As the echoes of Verdun and Vichy still linger, one truth remains. History never forgets, and neither should we. If this journey moved you, let your voice join the conversation. Leave your thoughts below. Was Petain a shield or a traitor? Share this story with someone who loves history's darkest questions. And don't forget to subscribe, because more untold stories of the past are waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, the past is never dead. It still speaks. And we're still listening.